survivor of the Holocaust, Janet Applefield. We're going to allow Janet to tell her story.
I lived with my mother and father, baby sister, in a little town 50 miles south of Krakow. And I lived there with a very large extended family, grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles. I remember the first few years of my life because they were really happy ones and good ones. By the way, my name was not Janet. My birth name was Gustava, and my nickname was Gija, which means baby. And throughout my childhood, my name was changed 3 different times. Also, my appearance had a lot to do with my survival because I was blonde, I had certain features, and I looked like a typical Aryan child. And I really have good memories of, those early memories of cooking, baking with my mother and my grandmother and the holidays and all that stuff. But of course, September 1st, 1939, all that changed. When the Nazis came to our town, my father sent me and my mother and my baby sister to my other grandparents' home in another little town nearby. And he and his brothers, he was one of 6 brothers, joined the Polish army. So when we arrived at my grandparents', everybody was packing up their belongings, and they were running in the direction of Russia. And my grandfather packed up some of our stuff into a horse and wagon, and we too joined this caravan of people that was streaming out of Poland and heading to Russia. I think there were about 200,000 Polish nationals that crossed the border. I was just 4 years old. But I do remember that there were planes overhead shooting at us, and we had to jump off the wagon and hide in a ditch. And sometimes the bridges and roads would be out, and we had to cross the river by foot. I remember seeing a plane that was shot down. It crashed and burned and crashed. So after several weeks of such very difficult travel, we arrived at our destination. Now, Poland was defeated in 1 month's time, and when that happened, Polish army disbanded, and my father and his brothers joined this caravan of people that was constantly streaming out of Poland into Russia. So when my father first arrived, he had no idea where we were. Communication in those days was pretty difficult. He advertised in the newspaper looking for us, and in time he found us. You can imagine we came with very few of our belongings, so when the men came, they had to figure out how to earn a living. They would take dairy products from the country and sell them in the city. A very sad and tragic thing happened. My baby sister contracted diphtheria, and obviously there was no medical treatment. It was wartime, and she died. She was just 18 months old. I also remember my mother getting very ill one time, running high fever. In those days when people had temperature, they used to take leeches. They put leeches behind my mother's ears, and that sucked the blood, and that supposedly reduced the fever. And the other thing they used to do, they were called banki. They would put these cups on the person's back. They would swab it with alcohol, light it, and then put these cups on the person's back that drew the blood to the surface of the skin, and my mother did get better. After we were in Russia for several months, there was an order issued that all these Polish nationals, in order to be allowed to stay, had to take out Russian citizenship. Well, the family was divided. They didn't know what to do. My parents were afraid to do that. Their thinking was that once the war would be over, they couldn't go back to Poland and get their property back. So we returned back to our town. But my grandfather and grandmother, one aunt and uncle stayed. The people who stayed were sent on trains to Siberia, where they were sent for hard labor, and my grandmother died there. I'm very fortunate because I have a lot of photographs which were saved by my grandfather. He's the one who survived. He's the only grandparent that survived, and he saved my photos. So when we arrived back in our town, at that point, all Jews had to wear their armbands to identify themselves as Jews. all the Jews had to live in a ghetto. This was an open ghetto. It didn't have a wall around it. One time, I remember, the Gestapo came to our apartment. They were searching to see if we were hiding any valuables. They made everybody undress. They were looking for money, jewelry, furs, and they took whatever they wanted. At first, my father was arrested because they said he was a communist because we came from Russia. Every day my mother would cook and we would bring his food to the jail. And in time my father was released. My parents one night decided that we were going to try to escape. So we left the ghetto, took off our armbands, obviously, went to the train station. That was a very dangerous thing that they were doing because often the plainclothes Gestapo would be in the train station. But we were able to take a train to another town where my mother had relatives living. But when we arrived there, it was a very similar situation because we know that the Nazis were so very well organized. My parents, one more time, made a decision that we were going to try to escape. So one night, my father got a horse and wagon, and we dressed in lots of layers of clothing. It was summertime. It was a very bright night. The moon was out. And we started to drive out of town. But we didn't get very far when suddenly, in the distance, we noticed Polish police approaching on horseback. And, being so fearful of Poles because of anti-Semitism, which was so severe in Poland, we got off the wagon and we started to run in the direction of fields in the distance. And when we got there, we saw that there were potato plants. We tried to hide, but potato plants are pretty short, and we were not successful. They found us, they beat us up, and they made us return. And it became very clear that there was no place to go. There was no place to run. My parents were pretty desperate. They were trying to find someone who would be willing to to take me and hide me. So they were able to convince a woman. Her name was Maria. Maria was a nanny to one of my cousins. She was half German and half Polish. And they pleaded with Maria, and she agreed to take me. So my parents sat me down one day and explained that I was going to go with Maria, that I should be good and listen to her, and that we would be reunited very soon. And unhappily, I left with Maria. In the meantime, there was an order issued that all the Jews on a particular day had to report at a sports stadium. My parents made one more decision. They decided that they were not going to walk into that stadium together. Their thinking was that if they separated from each other, maybe one of them would survive. So that day, they walked into that stadium, and there was a selection going on. There was a group of SS officers sitting in the front, and as people were walking in, these few men made a decision who would live and who would die. I understand that there were 10,000 people at that selection. They were coming from all different areas. That day, several hundred men, women, and children were taken to a local forest. They were made to dig their own graves, and they were shot into the graves. So then the strong adults were sent to one side, and women and children were sent to the other side. And my father was sent to the Krakow ghetto. My mother, I didn't know for just till maybe 3 years ago exactly what had happened, and I had already mentioned that. So to get back to my story, so I left with Maria, and we went back to the city. She had an apartment in Krakow. I remember so well being there because she would go out in the evening, lock the door, and leave me alone. I was really scared. I'd be crying. There was no electricity in the apartment, so I was in this pitch black apartment and no way to get out. And one day there was a sharp knock on the door. Maria opened the door. There was an SS officer standing there, and he said, I have orders to search your apartment to see if you're hiding any Jews. He barged in, and he looked under all the furniture, turned over furniture, came up to me, had long braids. He held up my braid, wanted to know who I was. Maria said that I was her niece. She was taking care of me because her sister was sick. So he looked at me, and he turned around, and he left. And I remember very well what he looked like. He was blonde, he had blue eyes, and he had sleek black leather boots that came up to his knees, and I could hear the clicking of his heels as he went down the steps. Now, my father was sent to the Krakow ghetto. Every morning at 4 o'clock, he and other prisoners were marched to a local cable factory. My father worked on an assembly line, making electrical cables. He told me he kept a little photo of me in front of him. He said that he wanted to live, he wanted to survive, because he gave me away and he had to find me. He also told me that he was starving because all that the prisoners were given to eat is black coffee and a little piece of bread in the morning, and at night very thin soup. And he said he had a German foreman who every once in a while would slip my father an extra piece of bread. And of course my father was so very grateful. So while my father was still living in the ghetto, the Nazis were building the concentration camp Płaszów on the outskirts of the city of Krakow. When that camp was completed, the Krakow ghetto was liquidated, and my father went to live in the camp. My father knew that he had to make different arrangements for me because Maria told him she couldn't keep me indefinitely. She was risking her life. He was able to contact a cousin who was living on falsified Polish papers. And one day, my care was transferred from Maria to this cousin. He gave my cousin everything he had, money, anything he had, maybe jewelry, I'm not sure what. And so I left with my cousin. My cousin was able to obtain a birth certificate from a Catholic priest of a little Polish Catholic girl who died. She was about the same age as I was. And I took her identity. I became her. Her name was Krystyna Antoszkiewicz, and her nickname was Krisha, so that was my new name. My cousin was very, very confident and very brazen, and so there would be times we would take the trolley car in the city, and she would always tell me to be quiet, not to speak, not to say a word, because Polish people were not permitted to sit in front of the trolley. They had to sit in the back. She was very confident, and I don't know, just I guess trying to test the system. And she spoke German fluently, and I didn't. That's why she told me to be quiet. We lived in another little town outside of the city. She was very mean and very vicious and cruel to me. She used to beat me with a fireplace poker. And one time she beat me so severely that all my fingernails turned black and they got infected and my nails fell off. There was a very nice lady who lived next door. Her name was Janina. I remember when my fingers were so badly injured, Janina made bandages for every one of my fingers. Sometimes my cousin would lock me out of the house and be gone all day. I'd be sitting on the front stoop, hungry and cold. Janina would sometimes give me a little piece of bread and jam, or sometimes she'd invite me to play with her little baby. I remember one time my cousin threw me into a river, told me to swim when I couldn't, and I almost drowned. I had to take these very, very big and heavy boxes to the post office. They were so big I could barely carry them. And at the time I didn't know what was inside those boxes. But later on I found out. She had a Polish boyfriend who used to come to see her all the time. And he had a shoe factory, but behind the shoe factory they were making ammunition, and she was in the Polish resistance. So inside those boxes were shoes and boots, but inside of those were all types of weapons, right? And I don't know where I was mailing these to, perhaps to other resistance groups. I have no idea where they were going. But one day, she told me she was going to meet her boyfriend in the city, and she took me with her. When we arrived in Krakow, she took me into a church, and she told me to sit and wait for her because she was going across the street to meet her boyfriend in a cafe. So I sat in that church, and I waited and waited and waited, and she never returned. So finally, I walked out of the church. It was late afternoon. The whole street was cordoned off, and I crossed the street, and there were little groups of people standing, and I overheard that the Gestapo had come because someone reported that there was a meeting of the resistance, and the Gestapo came and arrested everyone. So here I was, 7 years old, walking up and down the street, crying. I didn't know where to go, what to do. Suddenly, a woman came up to me and very quickly put me under her cape and said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Well, my cousin was there in that cafe, but she's gone." I said, "Could you please take me to the bus?" I was going to go back to my town, and she said, "No, you're too little." So she took me into the same building where the cafe was, upstairs to the apartment of a woman by the name of Alicia Goem. Alicia asked me, "Who are you? What happened? Where are you from?" I had a story that I had rehearsed to tell in case I was ever captured. And the story was that I was the child of a Polish officer. I came from Warsaw, and my parents were killed in a bombing raid, and I was being taken care of by this cousin, and now she was gone. Alicia accepted my story and said I could stay, but actually I couldn't stay right there in that apartment for 3 reasons. One was that Alicia's mother was very active in the Polish resistance, and in her apartment she ran a hospital, and she had all types of ammunition and shortwave radios. Another reason was that there was an SS officer living in the apartment building. And the third reason was that the Gestapo always came back once they made an arrest. So that evening, the oldest son took me, and we walked for several miles to the outskirts of the city, and we came to a farm that was owned and operated by the Catholic Church, and Alicia's brother-in-law was the administrator of this farm. So I remained on the farm. I remember one time we had just slaughtered a pig, but Polish people were not permitted to kill animals for their own consumption. But they were, it was big mess in the kitchen. They were cutting up the carcass, stuffing the sausages. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. Someone came to tell us that the Gestapo was on the way. So we cleaned everything up. We hid everything in the attic, and they came, and I was really scared. I'm not sure what made me do what I did, but I said, "Give them vodka." So they were drinking, and then and I started to sing and dance. And so they were laughing and drinking, and they finally left. My father had told me of an incident that happened to him in the camp. One night, in the middle of the night, he had to use the outhouse. He found a cigarette stub, and he was smoking. A guard saw him and shot him in the face. The bullet lodged under his cheekbone and just stopped right there. So, of course, he couldn't get any medical attention, so that bullet remained in my father's face. When the Nazis realized they were losing the war, they wanted to destroy any evidence, so they burned the camp to the ground. Today, there's just a monument standing in that place. And the remaining prisoners were sent off to other concentration camps. My father ended up in 3 different camps. So we were liberated by the Russians, and I remember that well because we too had to use the outhouse, and they were fighting all around the farm, so we were risking our lives. So once the war was over, my cousin's father found me. He found where I was. He was inquiring, I'm not sure how he found me, but he did. And I didn't really want to go with him because I was afraid of him, just the way I was afraid of his daughter. But the family didn't feel they had the right to keep me. They were pretty attached to me, but they felt they had to let me go. So I left with this cousin. But he turned me over to the refugee center in Krakow. He didn't keep me. So that was a place where the survivors went when they could get some help. You can just imagine they were sick. They had no money. They had no clothing. They were malnourished. They were close to death. And so this was a place where they could go and get some help. So I was there with other children. I was 10 years old when the war ended. There were maybe 70 of us, and very few Jewish boys, because in those days only Jewish boys were circumcised. So the few boys in the room, some were wearing dresses, and some were so frightened that they stayed under a table. They wouldn't even come out. They were so afraid. Every day there were lists posted on the wall with names of survivors. And along came a woman. Her name was Lena Kuhler. She came every day because she was looking for her family, her husband, child, sister. And she came across this room full of children, and she made a decision that she had to do something for the children. So in time, she was able to open 2 orphanages. So I remember the night we left for the orphanage. We had to leave in the middle of the night because there were men and women picketing in front of the refugee center, carrying hateful slogans saying that we all should have been murdered. So we left in the middle of the night. We climbed into the trucks. They pulled covers over us so we wouldn't be seen. One of the trucks went to an orphanage for children who had tuberculosis, and so many did. So I went to live in an orphanage. And Lena was always afraid that our home would be attacked. So she, first of all, only the older children were sent to the public school, high school age children. But every day the children were beaten up by the Polish children. Lena pleaded with the principal and the teachers, but they didn't do anything. But she was always afraid that our home would be attacked. So she obtained ammunition, and the older children were trained in use of ammunition. And one night, a Polish lady knocked on the door telling us that our home would be attacked. So the children took their positions on the roof and on the balcony, and in the middle of the night, Polish men came. They were on horses, and they were carrying fire torches, and they were firing at the home, but the children were able to defend the home. One day, Lena went back to the refugee center to pick up some provisions, and she overheard a man asking about his daughter. And she said to him, "Can you describe what your child looks like?" And he did. And she said, "I think I have your child." So Lena came back to the orphanage. She called me down to her office and said, "I have this wonderful news to tell you. Your father has survived." And I will always remember the reunion with my dad because I was so afraid of him. He looked like a skeleton. He just looked terrible. And he was hugging and kissing me and telling me he's going to take me. I didn't want to go because for the first time I had friends. Lena was our mother, so we called her mother. My father was very sick. He couldn't take me, so he rented a room nearby. He got stronger, he gained weight, and he recuperated, and in time he took me. We went back to our town, and few of my other father's friends survived. We all lived above my grandfather's store, but we weren't safe there because there were notes posted on the door saying we would be murdered. So several of my father's friends were murdered after the war. Young men driving in a car, they were ambushed and shot. And so my father went to the police chief pleading for protection, and the police chief said that all he could do is to give my father a gun. So he slept with a gun, and it became very clear that we had no future in Poland. We left our town. We moved back to the city where it was a little safer, and it became clear that we had to leave. We couldn't get our property back, and certainly we were not welcome or wanted. So it took, so my father had a brother in Palestine and one brother in this country, and he asked me where I wanted to go. And I said, I want to go to America because I heard that money grew on trees. So anyway, my father had some distant relatives living in New Jersey who sent us proper documentation. So basically these documents stated that in case my father couldn't support himself and support me, that the family would take care of us so that we would never become a burden. We wouldn't have to go on public assistance. So we arrived here in March of 1947, and we settled in New Jersey, and my uncle took me to school. I was 11, almost 12 when I came. I had never been to school. I knew how to read and write in Polish, but I didn't speak any English. So he took me to school to register me, and right there in the school office, he said, what name do you want? You have to have an American name. So I wasn't prepared for that question. I thought for a moment, and I came up with the name Janet, because we had a French cousin who came from Paris, and she used to visit us. She was beautiful and glamorous, and she had long red nails. And her name was Jeanette, and my uncle said, well, in English it's Janet, so that's how I got my name. And then, but we had another really big problem, and that is that we came on a 30-day visitor's visa. No, not 30 days, sorry, 90 days. In 90 days, we had another visa to go to Venezuela. The only way we could remain in this country is if my father got married to an American citizen. So the family looked around, they found him a wife. And so my father got married within that 90-day period. So here I was, I had a new stepmother, I had new name, new language, new appearance. They cut my hair, and everything was new. And so I started school. I was promoted. This was in April, but by June I was promoted to 7th grade, which was the appropriate grade for me. And in those days, there were no services for foreign-born. We had to learn English. My father went to the movies. I learned in school. And obviously, I continued school, and I was a good student. I was active in high school. And then I started college. And at age 19, I got married, because in those days, girls married so young, and it was not a good idea. But as a result of that marriage, I have 3 fabulous kids and 5 grandkids. So that was good. So today, I still continue in my profession. I'm a social worker. I work part-time, and then the rest of the time I spend speaking and doing other things. And thanks so much for listening. That's my story.
We are still alive thanks to people who have helped. This is the good part of human being, and I still believe that good is inside of us.